Well. Good evening, everybody. Um, we are going to have a very special Parliament C40 session today. We have a special guest here with us. Uh, I'm going to share her name in a minute. Let me first introduce properly the Parliament. We are just starting a new Parliament session belonging to the July 17 of 2025, and we have a special guest today, Colonel Watkins. She's gonna share with us some of her findings investigating um, a so-called Operation Gladio and the connections um, that pertain from that operation and like operations at Gladio with all the problems that the Cuban people had having since in 1952. It doesn't mean that the findings are conclusive in a way that maybe part of our problem has to do something with her findings, and maybe there's something missing in here yet. So anyway, we consider important for us at least to know, to have a different point of view from the perspective uh, of one person as the colonel, who is a busy, worried about the future of the United States as any other true American citizen, a responsible American citizen. And in that sense, it's very important to know that the worries that the American people have is not different as the worries that the Cuban people have too. In a way that the Cuban people have already lost the republic, and the American people is suffering now all the turmoil around on how globalist, communist, socialists like to do to crumble a republic and establish a different governing system. With that said, Colonel, allow me to introduce in Spanish for the Spanish-speaking people. Buenas noches a todos. Estamos iniciando una nueva sesión del Parlamento C40, esta la correspondiente a julio 17 del año 2025. Tenemos en la noche de hoy como invitada especial a una coronel retirada del ejército norteamericano, se llama Colonel Watkins. Ella ha estado investigando seriamente en los últimos 2 años, o quizás más, algo que se llamó Operación Gladio, que surgió a finales del año 1948, cuando se acabó la Segunda Guerra Mundial, y como van a ver en la explicación que ella va a dar, muchas de estas cosas han tenido y siguen teniendo serias influencias sobre nuestras repúblicas, sobre todo en Hispanoamérica y en distintas partes del mundo. Entonces, la mayor parte de la conversación va a ser en inglés y vamos a tener a alguien aquí que, si ustedes necesitan hacer preguntas y eso, va a estar traduciendo. Let me pass the microphone over to Colonel Towner, so that way she can say at least hi, everybody. Colonel?
Hi.
Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi. How are you doing?
Great. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Would you like to say hello to everybody in English? We are going to have the helping here of Gabriel. He's going to be co-hosting. Well, actually, Gabriel, I'll send you the co-host. I don't know why you didn't accept it.
I haven't received it yet.
No?
Just
Okay.
Send it again, please.
Okay. I'm going to send you the co-host right now. Oh, my God. Okay. Give me just a minute. Give me a minute, Gabriel. Colonel, I was explaining to the people exactly that you're going to start presenting to us your findings about Operation Gladio and we are not gonna interrupt you in your exhibits. What you're gonna say, I think it's better to have everything together. And after you finish, we're gonna start passing the mic to all the people that wanted to make a questions or comments or whatever you have said. And of course, I count that you're gonna have some little time, extra time maybe, to answer all those questions. Um, so we are pretty much ready to start, and I'm counting on Gabriel. I'm gonna pass in the co-host in a minute. And probably I'm gonna need to restart the session. I don't know why these things is often happening here. He's gonna help us translating from the people that don't really understand that much of the English or want to make a question in Spanish but they don't know how to translate it into English. So Gabriel is going to be helping us with that. With that said, en Spanish, la invitada va a estar hablando continuadamente, haciendo su exposición. No le vamos a interrumpir. Vamos a dejar que ella explique todo lo que tiene que hacer. Va a ser en inglés. Sabemos que esto es un pequeño problema con algunas personas que no lo entienden, pero al final de esta sesión, esto se va a convertir en un video y va a tener subtitulaje, así que los que no hayan entendido todo lo podrán entender un poco después. Una vez que ella termine, se van a ir pasando los micrófonos para que le puedan ir haciendo preguntas. Si tienen problemas con el inglés, Gabriel está aquí para ayudarnos a traducir, al igual que, bueno, está Vivoa también y varias otras personas aquí que entienden el inglés, un poco así como yo también. Así que, with that said, Coronel, if you are ready, shoot, we are ready to.
Okay. So just I know there's several people in here that do not follow me, so I want to give you kind of an overview of what Operation Gladio is, like in just a couple of minutes, and how I stumbled upon it. So Operation Gladio basically began after World War II, and it was a NATO and intelligence agencies across the world that colluded to set up paramilitary covert operations inside of sovereign countries for operations in the future that would be conducted domestically. It was originally sold to everybody on the inside because no one on the outside knew anything about it, that it was to fight communism. It was never used to fight communism. It was used to create instability or destabilization inside of countries that had either wanted to elect someone because they interfered with elections. And if the people in these countries elected someone that the US or European leadership within NATO didn't want to be president of that particular country, they would launch covert operations to destabilize the governments and eventually overthrow the government. Sometimes that ended in assassinating the president. Sometimes that ended in sending the president into exile. In the case of Iran in 1953, they put the Mossadegh, the prime minister, under house arrest for the rest of his life. So there were many different dispositions of the leadership that they disagreed with. And I kind of stumbled across Operation Gladio. I spent 30 years in the US military and had never heard of it. And I began doing research into Operation Gladio. And one of the first things that I discovered was its connection to what I refer to as an international syndicate of business oligarchs that wanted to exploit particular countries for their natural resources and various other reasons. They wanted control of the country. Generally, for their natural resources or a labor pool of the peasantry, the lower class people in the country. And one of the things that led me to Operation Condor, and Operation Condor was specifically for Latin America. It was basically the exact same operation being conducted in the Western Hemisphere. And one of the things that I began noticing is every single time I read declassified CIA documents or State Department documents, I began noticing that every single pretense of overthrowing a government was, oh my gosh, we can't allow that country to have this particular president because he could be communist. Not that he was, but he could be, and we could have another Castro on our hands. And so it became almost like they were using Cuba as a straw man to justify overthrowing government after government after government throughout Latin America. Well, that got me to very curious about the history of the Cuban Revolution and how that came about. And in Paul Williams' book, Operation Gladio, he illustrates the connection between the mafia and drug trafficking to pay for this, because most of these operations were not done with appropriated funds through the US government. They were done using covert funding from drug trafficking and weapons trafficking and human trafficking, because those transactions are all done in cash. They set up entire banking complexes like BCCI, Castle Bank, Nugent Hand Bank in Australia in order to orchestrate this entire operation. And one of the things that kept coming up was Cuba. And obviously, everyone knows that during the Batista period, that he was basically in bed, not just with the CIA, but with the mafia and many other elements of this Operation Gladio. Again, Cuba kept coming up again and again and again. And so the CIA operations that basically was orchestrated out of Miami in the JM Wave operation conducted by the CIA was specifically focused at Cuba in the aftermath of the revolution in order to quote unquote get Castro. And so if you go back during the Batista administration in Cuba, the buying up of large swaths of Cuba by US investors became very common. And the companies like United Fruit, I came across William Pauly, who goes on to, he was a multimillionaire in the United States. He also orchestrated the creation of the Chiang Kai-shek's Air Force and Navy over in Asia, in order to corner the market on opium that was coming out of southern China, Thailand, Laos, Burma, and that opium was being processed through the Corsican Mafia in France and the Sicilian Mafia in Sicily. So at the beginning of the pipeline of this massive drug trafficking operation, Cuba became a hotspot for bringing in the refined heroin that came out of the labs in France and Italy and came into Cuba, was cut with Cuban sugar, and then distributed throughout the United States. And so again, I kept coming back to Cuba. So there was several things that were going on inside of Cuba during this time, because there was a lot of unrest because they were trafficking the younger generations to be employed with the mafia, and basically just a takeover of the economy there. And there were quite a few elite families in Cuba that was in on this entire operation and exploiting a lot of the lower middle class and lower class people throughout Cuba. And that obviously generated a lot of anger and revolutionary type activities inside of Cuba. What I stumbled across was the CIA understanding that they had probably went a little too far of the increased mafia presence there, the drug trafficking, and that there was an honest to God revolution pending. They provided CIA assets to Castro and his brother and Che Guevara as they were up in the. There was some training done in Mexico originally, and that train cadre moves over to Cuba into the mountainous area, and there were CIA agents basically trying to co-opt that revolution. And the Batista government had its own contingent of CIA agents, so they were basically playing both sides against the middle. The CIA wanted to continue using Cuba for its intended purpose of trafficking drugs into the United States. And they were determined that whichever way it went, they were going to be able to co-opt it. Either keep Batista and allow the exploitation of the Cuban people to continue, or help Castro and try to get on his good side and be able to co-opt him as well. In the aftermath of the revolution, obviously the trying to co-opt Castro didn't work. And they set immediately about trying to overthrow him as well. And I just want to mention a few, because a lot of people don't know the extent to what the activities of the CIA in trying to take out Castro. Even before Castro had confessed to be a communist, while he was still just basically trying to take the land from the US oligarchs and redistribute it to the Cuban people at the beginning of it. That was not allowed. That had been attempted in Guatemala. That had been attempted in Brazil. That had been attempted in Nicaragua. And every single time anyone attempted that in Latin America, the CIA overthrew the government successfully. Now, obviously, we know they never successfully overthrew the Castro government, but I surmise that at some point when they realized they weren't going to be able to overthrow the Cuban government, they realized that having Castro in their backyard was a very useful tool in order to be able to justify overthrowing other governments in Latin America using Operation Condor. Because again, every single State Department cable, every single CIA cable during the operations throughout Latin America all reference Castro. We can't have another Castro. We can't have another Castro. So I became very jaded at the end of researching Cuba that excuse me, in some respects, Castro became much more useful to the CIA by leaving him in place to justify the overthrow of all these other governments than he would have ever served once they had already moved the drug trade into Latin America, like Colombia and Panama and those other countries. Once that happened, it was not critical to continue their operations against Castro. And yet they tried over 400 times, according to their own documentation, to kill Castro. But I I increasingly find that very difficult to believe, since they were very successful at killing just about every other foreign leader they tried to kill. So there, I have a huge uh, sneaking suspicion that some of those efforts weren't as genuine as they have led us to believe. But anyway, some of the operations, one of them was called Operation 40. Operation 40 was designed to create a covert operation inside of Cuba using Cuban exiles that had been relocated to the Miami area. They were trained inside the United States in southern Florida to sabotage, assassinate, and gather intelligence. There were it was established in 1960, and they basically was teaching them guerrilla tactics, sabotage, targeted killings, and disrupting Cuban infrastructure. They were deployed and infiltrated Cuba. Some ended up getting captured, but some did not. And the um, the there's not any good outcomes that came of that, obviously, because they were never able to destabilize Castro to the extent that the Cuban people rose up against him. But several of the people that were involved in Operation 40 later went on to be involved in things like the JFK assassination, Watergate, and even some of them were responsible for the assassination of former Chilean ambassador Lettier in downtown DC, where they planted a car bomb. So these people were deadly serious about what they were doing. Another operation that they launched, and this one I'm going to do a post about tomorrow because this one is fascinating in a really evil sort of way. It was called Operation Peter Pan, where the CIA used the Catholic Church inside of Cuba to propagandize. And this is something that the CIA worked hand in hand with the Catholic Church in the aftermath of World War II, ratlining people into Latin America that had been former SS officers. They used the Catholic Church to money launder a large extent of their drug money coming out of Asia before they got their banks set up in the 70s to do that in conjunction with the Vatican Bank. So the Vatican is very much involved in all of this Operation Gladio stuff. But in 1960, Operation Peter Pan was set up, and the guy that everybody's been talking about recently in connection with the JFK documents released was also, because he specialized in psychological operations, was involved in Peter Pan. And Peter Pan was a propaganda campaign that was launched using Swan Island communication. It is a big radio tower that was, Swan Island is off the coast of Cuba, and it was used throughout this time to broadcast radio into Cuba that was anti-Castro. So they used that radio station and the Catholic Church to create an underground propaganda campaign with the Catholic Church actively involved in telling parents in Cuba that Castro was going to immediately strip parental rights from everyone in Cuba, and all of their kids were going to be sent to a communist training camp. There was no such plan. It was a complete lie. And as a result, over 14,000 children was smuggled out of Cuba and brought into Miami and taken into the custody of the Catholic Church and a Jewish religious organization based in Miami. And many of them found themselves in foster homes and adoption and all, and they all thought as children, and they weren't like babies, and there was a lot of information that was originally published that said they were babies. They weren't babies. They were like adolescents, on up to like 17 years old, and the majority of them were males. And the organization that was orchestrating all of this was called the Catholic Welfare Bureau. But between 1960 and 1962, over 14,000 children was underground smuggled out of Cuba. It was the largest effort ever to basically relocate children to a foreign country. So, another operation, Operation Patty, Patty, that was a guerrilla warfare and sabotage operation launched inside of Cuba to weaken the revolutionary government and create conditions for an uprising. And Operation Patty was named after a female CIA operative that was infiltrated into Cuba. And the target area was the mountainous area of Cuba to establish guerrilla forces. And it was aimed at disrupting the government control, attacking infrastructure, destroying crops, and communication lines. And they were supposed to be seeking out people that they could co-opt into joining their effort. The operatives had arms, explosives, and communication equipment that was airdropped into their locations. So there was another one called Operation Labario, which was also very similar to that. Operation Labario involved smaller scale infiltration missions by CIA-backed Cuban exiles. So by this time, they've trained enough of the Cuban exiles in Miami to begin reasserting them back into Cuba and have them operate for plausible deniability for the CIA. They were distributing propaganda, sabotaging, and conducting espionage. The target of this operation was the urban areas and some of the farms. They their targets were sugar plantations and to gather intelligence on the Cuban military capability. Another one, Operation Pluto, which was the official name of the Bay of Pigs. And I think we all know enough about the Bay of Pigs that we don't need to rehash that operation. But also another one was Operation Mongoose. And that one was a campaign of sabotage, assassination attempts, and psychological warfare to destabilize Cuba. So we're spending what would now be billions of dollars to basically take Cuba back. And their main intent was to continue for the US companies, which I do want to, I did research before on the companies that were involved, and I want to get to that real quick because I think that's key so everybody understands what the impetus behind all of this was. So obviously one of the major industries in Cuba was sugar, and that basically made up 80% of their exports in the 1950s. And the US, of course, was the primary target or primary market, sorry. Companies included the Cuban American Sugar Company. It was one of the largest US owned sugar companies. It operated several sugar mills in Cuba and controlled the vast, a large segment of the vast plantations that were distributed throughout Cuba. Another company, United Fruit Company, obviously they were involved in the agricultural area as well, to include sugar production and bananas. American Sugar Refining Company, which we know today as Domino Sugar, was intimately involved in the exploitation of the Cuban workers on their sugar plantations as well. And one other company that it doesn't exist anymore. But together they controlled the majority of the sugar production inside of Cuba. The utility companies, Cuban Electric Company was a subsidiary of American and Foreign Power Company that basically was a US firm that controlled all of the electrical production in Cuba. International Telephone and Telegraph Company, ITT. For those of you who don't know or don't follow me on a regular basis, ITT was involved in many of the coups. ITT was a primary player in the Chilean coup that overthrew President Allende. They had made vast investments all over the world in telephone and telegraph infrastructure, and they basically functioned as an intelligence front. Because they controlled all of the telegraph and telephone communication into and out of a country, they reported on any activity that they thought the US government was interested in to either the State Department before the CIA or directly to the CIA after it was set up. So presidents had a right to be leery of ITT because they were in fact spying on the foreign countries they did business in. Havana Trolley Company and the bus system was owned by William Pawley, and I mentioned William Pawley earlier. He was intimately involved in Operation Gladio all over the world, and he was a very good friend of Batista and operated, as a matter of fact, at one point, William Pawley lived in Miami and he owned a big yacht. He was a multimillionaire. And he took his yacht and put Cuban exiles on his yacht, went down to Cuba and launched those Cuban exiles in an attack against Cuba. That's how intimately involved in the CIA William Pawley was. He goes on to be ambassador in a couple of other countries throughout Latin America that was also involved in coups. Okay, several hotels were owned by US, especially the ones that had gambling and casinos. Those were all owned by US and obviously linked to mafia. The notable one is Hilton Hotels. In the banking area, Bank of America, Chase Manhattan Bank, and First National City Bank of New York, which is now Citibank, all had operations in Cuba that was doing the banking of all of these oligarchs that were exploiting the Cuban people. Mining companies, Freeport Mining, which later they merged with Anaconda. And Anaconda was a big copper guy in Chile that was also intimately involved in the coup with President Allende down there. Bethlehem Steel had interest in iron ore that was being mined out of Cuba. General Motors and Ford Motor Company. Ford Foundation basically functions as a CIA front as well. They had huge distribution networks in Cuba for cars and dealerships. They catered almost exclusively to the Cuban elite and American residents there. Colgate Palmolive, Procter and Gamble was there, Standard Oil was there, Texaco was there, and Pan Am. Pan Am was the major, they also did a lot of CIA cargo hauls, but Pan Am was basically the primary carrier although Delta had some, Pan Am was the big carrier into Cuba at the time. So I wanted to get that part out of the way so that you can understand what the interest was for the US oligarchs into getting Cuba back. It had nothing to do with justice or freedom for the Cuban people. It had everything to do with their financial investments in Cuba and the exploitation of the Cuban workers. So I wanted to talk real briefly about some of the CIA officers that were intimately involved in running these operations. Of course, Ted Shackley is the guy that ran JM Wave. He was intimately involved in all of the operations relating to Cuba. William Harvey was another one. He was the task force leader for Operation Mongoose. Other people, and by the way, William Harvey was intimately involved with the mafia as well. He was a liaison with Johnny Roselli, and Roselli was a hitman for the mob. The E. Howard Hunt, he was a staff officer and a big player in the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And E. Howard Hunt obviously was involved in Watergate and the JFK assassination and many other Operation Gladio events. David Atlee Phillips was the propaganda and political action officer. He basically was, along with George Jonides, the guy who was file was just finally released, and his connection to the JFK assassination. They ran the propaganda, so they were the muscle behind the propaganda campaign that led to all of the children being relocated into the United States. David Sanchez Morales, he basically was the lead in the paramilitary and covert operations part of all of these activities that we talked about. He was also a main player in eventually tracking down Che Guevara in Bolivia. And let's see, Jerry Droller, Droller. He worked alongside E. Howard Hunt as basically his assistant. So he did a lot of the same things. But interestingly enough, Droller has a very interesting background that ties him directly back to Germany and some of the shenanigans on the startup of Operation Gladio in Europe, which we got the idea from the German Nazis. The Stay Behind unit, the paramilitary covert operations, had its origins in the Nazi Germany. So he is a very interesting guy. He also was critical in forming Brigade 2506, which I'm sure you guys probably all know. Brigade 2506 was used not just against Cuba, it was used in the death squads, training the death squads in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, in Guatemala. They used the Cuban exile trained people out of the Miami CIA station to do operations all over the world. There were members of the Cuban exiles in the Congo when we overthrew Mossadegh. They were in Angola when we were over there destabilizing that government. They were all given a special program that if they joined the army for 4 years, they would all be given citizenship. And almost all of them ended up in Vietnam and were part of the Phoenix program there, which we know killed eventually over millions of people throughout all of those countries, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and in Vietnam. So these were not two bit players. These were people that had significant ties to overthrowing a lot of other governments. And these people all conducted these operations against Cuba. So that's probably a good place to stop to see if anybody has any questions.
Yes, we have Mator. You want to say something, Eduardo?
Pase the word to Mator. Adelante, Mator.
Go
Mator?
ahead, Mater. Mater, go ahead.
Sí, muy buenas noches. Do you want this in English or in Spanish?
No, it gotta be in English. She doesn't speak Spanish.
Ah, I see. Okay. Uh,
Si no sabes inglés, di lo que quieras en español y yo traduzco.
um, I will. I will do it I will do it in English. No problem. Okay. So I guess the whole audience understand, right? No, no problem. Well, look. Respectfully, I'm from. Some of you might know I'm from sumemos.por and I'm listening to this. And it's absolutely crucial that we understand the complexities of what has happened in Latin America. Because the narrative about who's responsible for what is often oversimplified, uh, well, there's been a lot of talk about Operation Condor and the actions of the CIA. And yes, those are parts of the history that have generated intense and justify debate about uh, soberanias, sovereignty, and human rights in the region. But to solely blame the CIA or the United States for all the problems or for the forceful responses that occur in certain countries is, in my opinion, a fallacy. Look, let's consider the influence of the Cuban regime. It's a fact that Castro's Cuba has played an active role in the region. We saw how they armed the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. You know, since they came into power in 1959, they have been arming people in Latin America. And that's how they were able to topple Anastasio Somoza in 1979. And now the Sandinistas have been in power for 46 years, moving millions of people from the region. That's not the United States, which also led to their seizure of power in other countries. There were attempts to expand their influence with the sending weapons to Chile, which is well documented. The supply of weapons and an establishment of ties with guerrillas or guerrillas in Colombia, which they still have the oldest guerrilla warfare in that country. The encouragement of guerrilla movements in Bolivia and the arming of guerrillas in El Salvador. These are the facts we cannot ignore. So when it's argued that the CIA or the United States carry out operations to take children out of Cuba, that was mentioned here, as a reason to disparage the CIA, or when there is an attempt to present the Cuban system as a victim of the U.S. operations, I believe we're failing into a sophisma in Espanol. It is a distortion of reality to portray Cuba as a victim when, or the regime in this case, when we know its history of promoting subversion and arming groups in other countries, which is contrary to the democratic interests of the entire Western Hemisphere and our interests. Now, it's true that there were strong and forceful actions by the United States, thankfully, like in Chile. And thankfully, today, Chile is the only developed country in Latin America. And other countries to halt the advance of communism, which is socialism right now. It's the same thing. Socialism is the economical system of communism, which communism is the political system. And yes, those actions had consequences, and some of them were very painful. But it is crucial to recognize that these actions did not occur in a vacuum. They were responses, often drastic, to a perceived and very real threat of ideological and military expansion by regimes like the Cuban, which we all know who were backing them, who were those countries in the other side of the world backing them. Now, my point, and I'm going to finish with just this. My point is that the history of Latin America is far more complex than a simple narrative of operations, of culprits and victims. There are many actors with their own agendas and responsibilities. We need to see the full picture and not allow a single perspective to dominate our understanding of what truly happened and why certain decisions were made. We're hurt, and excuse my language, but we're butt hurt because millions of people have been displaced. And this has nothing to do with the CIA or the United States government, which has been really nice for this continent. Okay? We wish to be able to go back to Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and some other countries, but we cannot. And it's those regimes the problems. It's not the United States of the CIA. That's all. Thank you.
Sure. Let me address a couple of your points. Understanding Operation Gladio and Operation Condor and the CIA's involvement in destabilizing Latin America is not blaming exclusively the CIA. There were far bigger powers than the CIA, while at the same time, you cannot deny that Operation Condor was a CIA program that specifically enabled the overthrow of governments throughout Latin America and instituted military dictatorship. You mentioned Chile. Chile was had both politically, they had a democratically elected president. And it doesn't matter if the rest of the world doesn't like who they got to choose as their president. They had a democratically elected president. When he ran the first time, the CIA bought the version of the New York Times newspaper down there to manipulate and run propaganda against him when he ran prior to him actually getting elected. He wasn't elected then. The CIA, not only after he was elected, tried to buy off the senators so that he didn't get confirmed and actually enter office. So at no time was he even allowed to assume the office without CIA interference. And ITT, Anaconda, and PepsiCo had a meeting in 1972 with Richard Nixon offering millions of dollars to overthrow that government. And it doesn't matter what country you're from, another country should not have the ability to fund foreign influence campaigns to determine who you get to elect as president. We don't allow it in the United States, and it should not be allowed in any country. And what got implemented, the military dictatorship of Pinochet and the creation of the DINA program, where their national police force and their intelligence forces was trained in the International Police Academy in Washington, D.C., on how to torture people and disappear people and kidnap people. That training was done in U.S. schools. So there are a lot of dynamics that go on in these operations, but you cannot ignore it. Nor can you ignore the fact that there was an economic blockade against Chile in the immediate aftermath of the assassination of Allende, or after he got elected president, sorry. The entire United States, he was cut off from any funding from the IMF to even be president. He was denied loans from the World Bank, and those were all ran at the time by US politicians and businessmen. So they economically isolated him. They did the exact same thing to several other governments down there in order to destabilize the country. The US State Department is on record saying, make their economy scream in order to bring Allende and the Chilean people to the point of revolution. They were willing to let the Chilean people starve because they disapproved of the president. So when all other funding gets cut off for you, you do the only thing that you have at that point. You do business with anybody that will do business with you. And unfortunately, when the United States decides that they're not going to do business with you, no other country is going to do business with you either if they want to do business with the United States. So who are the only people that would stand up and do business with a country that the US decided they didn't like their president? Castro in Cuba and the Soviet Union. And as soon as they do the first business deal with them, they label the president a communist, regardless of whether he is or not, and bring in the covert operations to overthrow the government. So you're right. You can't look at any of this in isolation. This is a huge, big effort that has been orchestrated over and over again. You can't ignore the facts.
The fact is they stole companies, they confiscated. That's why they didn't do business, just like in Cuba. That's
They
the fact.
didn't steal any companies. The Allende offered restitution to every single one of those countries or companies. They refused it and went instead to Nixon and paid him to overthrow the government. They weren't interested in restitution. They wanted the resources of copper and the ownership of the telephone companies in Chile.
Okay, Maito, if you want to speak again, raise your hand. Don't interrupt. Otherwise, we're going to remove the mic from you. Gustavo, then White, and then I'm gonna speak a little. Okay, Gustavo, adelante. Go ahead.
Gustavo, te toca.
Hey, good night, everybody. Buenas noches. Uh, Hi, Colin. I've been hearing some of your space. Sometimes I'm very familiarized with this narrative of conspiration, and it's the first time I hear from an American, natural American military perspective. Uh, they say that when there's a chain of success, each of one doesn't happen logically. It's because behind them is an intelligence work. And the lucky of Fidel Castro is a change of not logical successes. So, I mean, I think that behind his lucky is a work of intelligence of CIA or United States at all, maybe another agency, I don't know. And 100% behind Fidel Castro is the CFR. And and the one thing that I'd like to point, because I can talk a lot about this, is all I do. My friends know me, but I will be touching some points for you to pay attention if you have the time in the future. I don't think that there was a revolution in Cuba. Cuba was a coup in 1952, and then start a fight against that dictator, and that was a constitutional war, a constitutional fight, similar to the one in Nicaragua in 1926. So it was not a revolution. That's why they didn't call themselves a revolutionary army or revolutionary groups. They called themselves rebels because they were in a rebellion against the dictator to reinstate the constitution, and that's the opposite of revolution. Revolution is actually a move to change the law order and to bring up a new one. If you want to reinstate the order of the law, the constitution, you are far from being a revolutionary movement. But for some reason they want to sell it to the whole world as a revolution. And actually, it was a state coup between January 3, 59, till February 7, 59. Fidel executed a state coup. He first concentrated the two powers in the hand, the Congress, solved the Congress and put the power of the Congress, the function of the Congress in the executive branch, and took over the executive branch. And then in days before the 7, he put the Supreme Court or equivalent to Supreme Court in that situation that they all has to immigrate because he took all the warranties that had the lawyers and so on. So it was a state coup from the position of the executive branch, which was practically the same situation that was before 1959. So in 1961, he finally said, I will not reinstate the Constitution, but the whole world bought the so-called revolution that was actually a state coup. I do think positively about what you said about the CIA. CIA is actually behind all this, and it's a false perception that United States wants democracy everywhere. No, there's some places when United States doesn't want democracy. There's many places in the world where United States wants a mix because there's a lot of resources in there, and these people, like in Venezuela, they should not be able to exploit those resources because as far as Venezuela is a reserve, the resource will be there. But at the moment when Venezuela starts to be efficiently, economically, and so on, those resources will start to be exploited for the good of that country. So that situation lead me to the idea that not always and not everywhere is in the interest of United States uh, stable situations, especially in Latin America,
So,
because
to add to your conversation, Kissinger is on record saying that Latin America cannot be a democracy, that they only react to strongmen. And they felt justified in installing military dictators in Latin America for that very reason. So you're absolutely right about that point.
yeah, and coming back to what we are a constitutionalist movement. We propose to reinstate the constitution in Cuba as a way to get through this situation. And sometimes, joking or not, we say that we want United States to stay away from us. Let us be. If you want to help us, stay away. It's like somebody like I think Diaz Valar said, "Oh, we are with the Cuban people. We have been with you fighting against this dictatorship for 65 years. It was 65 years then. Then I commend. It's about the time to stay away a little bit to see if we can do something because actually I don't think that United States doesn't need to overthrow Cuban government. Cuba is a very stable country as all the countries in the south border of the United States, they are stable. Mexico is stable, got mafia, got all that, but it's a stable country. Cuba is a stable country. Dominicana is a stable country. Haiti is a little crazy, but it's not our culture and it's tiny. And well, so if you got your south border stable, that's what is important. You don't want this explosion of wars or immigration or whatever happening in your border. You want a stable. Doesn't matter socialist, communist, whatever. You want
That's
it to
what
be
the
stable.
American people want. The American people want our government not to decide who other people's president is. And we do encourage stability, but the forces that are orchestrating this are not representative of the American people. They're the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Whitneys, and all of
Yeah,
the oligarchs that money is invested in these foreign countries, and they are using the CIA and the US military to ensure that their investments are protected. And when a president comes to power, that democratically elected president that wants the resources to be used for their people, and they want those resources, and they want the jobs for normal paying jobs, not slave wager jobs, and the inability to allow the workers to unionize as they do in America. It's like they have a completely different standard in foreign countries because they've shipped all of our jobs to these foreign countries, and they can't afford to have a democratically elected president take care of its own people, because that negates the fact of why they went there for the resources to begin with.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna talk another minute because I see many hands up, and I think just I'm gonna touch some point. Fidel Castro, I always saw as a made in U.S. So for me, Fidel Castro is American product. He loved America, and I think he was hired by the CIA somewhere down the road. And he was not a revolutionary. He was not a communist. That's a lie. That's a show for the world to believe. And through him, I used to say that Cuba is a spy country. Cuba is a spy country. Doesn't mean every Cuban is a spy. We are used as tools, but we as a whole, we are a spy country that we were sent to Asia, to the Soviet Union, to Africa, to anywhere where the United States want to have control from the left side. They sent us, and we were welcomed by the enemies of the United States without knowing that we are representing the United States somewhere under the table. That's why Allende got killed. That's why uh, Thomas Sankara got killed in Africa. That's why this guy in Panama, Torrijos, was killing, and all by the CIA, and with a connection with Cuba. And if the United States wants to overthrow or destabilize a country, the United States will do what it's doing with Ukraine right now, because Cuba compared with Russia is a joke. It is literally a joke compared with what is Russia. And you see what is how temerary, how dangerous is what we're doing in Ukraine for us, and nevertheless we're doing it. So why the hell we don't do anything like that with Fidel Castro? Because Bay of Pigs was a joke, was a joke. They were not supposed to go to the Bay of Pigs. They were supposed to go to another
Correct.
place.
Correct.
They diverted to the air because they are only crocodiles and mosquitoes. They could be there 5 days without fighting. They will not do anything. And that was a trick. They tricked us with that. They tricked us with the Caribbean crisis. The Caribbean crisis, the result of it was the deal in 1966 about no proliferation of nuclear weapons. That's what it was for, and to distract us for other things, important things. Uh, all these people, starting from Truslow in the Commission Truslow. Truslow was a member of the CFR, and he did the inform. After a week after that, he got killed in the ship going to Brazil. And last thing, this promise the last thing. You told about, if you read the fourth floor from Smith, on the first paragraph of the prologue, he say, I write this book to show the revolution of Fidel Castro was absolutely not necessary, and show to the American people that the policies of the United States with Cuba are dangerous for the interest of the American people. He never talked about, he didn't go about the government. So the policies with Cuba are dangerous and go against the interest of the American people. And thank you very much, Eduardo. I hope you know who's going next.
Okay, Wilfredo, give me a minute. Um, I'm just not gonna make any question because anyway I've been talking with Colonel Towner several times, more than once. So and but I want to make a short note on this, and it's about what Mato was saying. This is very simple and it's a kind of troublesome for some people. Most of the people, many people, believe that all our problems are just made, created by the dictators in power in Cuba, but also most of the countries or the national for Latin American countries also believe that the problem they have is all made up by their own dictators and all of that. Part of that is true. Part of that is true. But some other part is not. You will not never address the problem. You will never solve the problem if you continue thinking that way. That means also that you are not looking for the truth. If you find the truth, you can start changing things and making or taking the right decision. Okay. Until that happens, you will still running around, blaming on something that is just part of the problem. And that's also happened to Cubans. This conversation is difficult for some Cubans because most of the things they blame that the suffering and all that happened to the Cubans, this is all blamed normally on Castros, dictators, and all of that. But some part of that is also mishandling of the United States government relationship with Cuba. And that is a big truth. There's nothing that we are lying about, that we don't need to make this up. We don't need to, somebody say, give a bone back to Castro's. No, no, no. We are just trying to unravel the truth. That's it. As close as we get to the truth, as close as we can get to the real solution in Cuba, to a real, to propose an idea that is sustainable in the future for the Cuban people to definitely solve the problem with the Castros, solve the problem with dictatorships, solve the problem on reestablishing or reinstating the Constitution and the Republic. If all of this is not well understand, it's going to be very difficult for Cubans to do something like that. We don't want, as a constitutionalist, to make the strongest point around this conversation, but we must know at least we have a basic we must have the basic know-how about how this whole thing happens and why it happens, and that's the reason that we are making this conversation today. So now,
Eduardo, if I could add something,
yes,
I think that because people have their own obvious personal experience, I want to throw out a theoretical question. I think I know myself believes that the election in 2020, where Biden and Trump competed against each other, was a rigged election. And I believe that the four instances of basically trying to impeach Trump and all of that during his first term was an attack on the United States. There are CIA ties to all of those activities, both with the Ukraine phone call that led to an impeachment. Russiagate was started in the CIA office, Gina Haspel over in London with the Steele dossier. So there's lots of CIA ties to all of that throughout his first administration and then up to the 2020 election. We all saw what happened on January 6th. There were, by anybody's numbers, use 1 million people that was in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. They saw basically a orchestrated mob, and there are allegations that there were Ukrainians that were part of stay behind capability linked to Operation Gladio units in Ukraine present in that crowd. So you have, millions of voters that went to the ballot box under a quote unquote democracy and cast their ballots to elect President Trump in 2020. So those supporters of Trump had their election stolen from them. And if on January 6th and thereafter, those people rebelled against the government that had been involved, the CIA, the FBI, and all of that. And there was actually a rebellion in the United States. The rebels took up arms and demanded justice. I don't think anybody in America would refer to those patriotic people that use the democracy system of voting. No one would refer to those people demanding justice as guerrillas. And yet, in all of these foreign countries that these same operations take place in, and the one gentleman mentioned Chile, that's exactly what happened. The Chileans went to the ballot box and they elected President Allende. Whether you like him or not, that's who they chose. The day after he was elected, all of his supporters began being labeled as guerrillas. They were not guerrillas. They were people who went and exercised their democratic rights to vote for a president. And eventually, the overthrown government of Allende and the installation of a military dictator, Pinochet, who, by the way, had been trained in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, in the School of Americas in Panama, all by the United States, and the CIA creation of the DINA, which was basically a terrorist organization to persecute the quote unquote guerrillas that were patriotic people that went and used the democratic system to elect their own president. So the terminology is very, very important when you're describing historical events. The people that try to elect a president using a democratic system do not overnight turn into guerrillas when a foreign government comes and interferes in their election process.
Correct. You're right, Carol. And also, I agree with you in many of the aspects that you have brought up right here. Some others were unknown to me, but as the main cause, I still agree with you that the 2020 election was rigged. That's it. Simple as that.
Yeah.
We all need to find out about how they did it, but we are still a long run to do that. I'm gonna pass the word to Wilfredo, then Ariana or Gabriel. Wilfredo, Gabriel, y Ariana, and then Mator. Yes, Mator. Okay. Wilfredo, go ahead.
Thank you so much to the Parliament Constitution 1940. It's the first time I'm in a space with an American people and hearing the idea, the perspective about the situation in Cuba. So I'm appreciating to I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, Colonel. Appreciate that you are here with us. I want to ask Colonel is the names Manuel Rocha and William Arthur Whelan is familiar for her.
Whelan is.
What about Rocha? Manuel Rocha.
Can you spell that last name?
Rocha. Manuel
Yeah.
Rocha.
Yeah, I recognize that name too.
Yeah, well, these two people, one, Rocha, was accused recently to be an agent from the Castro regime for years. In the case of Whelan, son, have a lot of influence in Eisenhower to deny the help, the military help to Batista during this process of the Castro initiated I don't think it's right and agree with Gustavo revolution. And asking
This space was downloaded via spacesdown.com. Visit to download your spaces today.
you these two names because both people, we have a lot of evidence, historical, that they helped the regime. For example, Whelan and Roberton, they didn't send the military help that Batista was requesting. And why all this happened? Why the Peter Pan operation, like you say? Why the Bay of Pig was a traition to the Cuban people? Why the U.S. denied the help to these people after the CIA was training all these guys in Guatemala, different other countries? Why Christ in 1963? Why the U.S. was permit all this? And when you are describing all the failed operation that the CIA did, trying to recover in Cuba, or kill Castro, or destroy the revolution, they say that it's a victory for us because all this operation failed, almost. And Cuba is there, the regime is there for 66 years. And I agree with Gustavo, and I think for some reason, maybe Castro was a CIA person. I don't know, maybe. But for some reason, the U.S. was permitting Cuba a genocide for 66 years. When the U.S. went to Guatemala for Jacobo Arbenz, went to Panama for Noriega, went to Granada for Maurice Bishop. Why they are not doing something real that is not going to be a fail to get a freedom in Cuba and help the Cuban to end this genocide? I know the situation of this country. You describe it perfectly. I know President Trump is in trouble every day because something wrong was happening here. How the communists was infiltrating CIA, FBI, was doing all this catastrophe in this country. I was not believing. If somebody was telling me 25 years ago when I come to the U.S. that this gonna be happen, I wanna say no. This cannot happen in this country, and happen. Do you have an idea that finally, after we resolve all these problems inside the the U.S. can really help to Cuba?
I mean, I'm not going to speak on behalf of the United States. I think that the you spoke about the both Whelan and Roca, and it really does speak to the complexity of everything. If you understand the background of people like Roca, his affiliation, his membership in the CFR, you he was in Argentina. He shows up in a lot of different areas, and when I first came across his name, he miraculously shows up where there's lots of chaos going on. Could he have been a spy? Yes. Does it appear that he was? Yes. I don't want anybody to misunderstand my talking about CIA's involvement in overseas covert activities as a defense of any one of their targets. I'm not defending any of the targets. I'm trying to make the point that as a US military officer that was deployed to wars that the CIA got us into under false pretenses, like Iraq, I take exception to the CIA generating chaos using lies to do it, that they get in over their head and then they call on the US military to go accomplish a job that they couldn't do on their own. And we die in foreign countries as a result of them doing these shenanigans. And I take exception to that because I was one of the people that was deployed into foreign countries where that happened. And that doesn't mean that I like Saddam Hussein. I think he was an evil man. But I also don't think that the United States government should be going in and telling a foreign country who their president is, especially when they're using covert means to do it. And they're manipulating the local people, and they're installing in the aftermath of all of this chaos a military dictator that has been trained by the United States government, and their intelligence apparatus and their military apparatus is being trained by the United States government under false pretenses, and then used to kill civilians in those countries. Because I call that out does not mean that I'm supporting any one of those people that are overthrown. I'm not. I could care less about who any of them are. What I care about is my government going and funding and doing this stuff, especially when some of these operations are funded with drug money that are, and the drugs are used to sell to the American people, and they overdose and kill these people. I think the entire apparatus needs to be undone.
I understand perfectly, and I want to ask you: do you think CIA is the same now that was the period that you described, all that they did, trying to take over Cuba to the liberty?
Well, we just overthrew the Bangladesh country just a couple of years ago. So are they doing the same things? Yes. The Slovakian president was an attempted assassination on him. Trump had an attempted assassination on him. They were intimately involved in trying to overthrow his government at least 4 times while he was president. So yes, I believe the CIA is still doing the exact same thing. Now, there has been changes since Trump's second administration with Radcliffe there, but you have to understand this is a generational thing. All of the Alan Dulleses, the people that we talked about throughout this, those people hired people. They didn't hire people that wasn't like them. They hired people and they trained people to do the exact same thing that they were doing. Lansdale, Angleton, Wisner, all of those people spawned generational CIA officers. They hired people to train them to do exactly what and then they hired people to train people, and they hired people. So it is a generational rot that is embedded in the CIA's DNA. It's what they were created to do. They were never created to be a central intelligence, neutral, honest assessment. If you look at the national intelligence estimate that they did, they included the Steele dossier in order to launch Russiagate against Trump. So that's just within the last 8 years.
Correct. Yes, in motion. Wilfredo, did you finish?
Yes, the last one I want to say, in Cuba, the last election, democratic election, was done in 1948. We never had a right to make election again, and we are under dictatorship, perpetrating a genocide. It's different to any other example, I think, in South America.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you on that.
Cuba on its own way is a different, very, very different from the remaining of the countries on Latin America. Very different. Gabriel, are you gonna pass the mic to Ariana and then you? Ariana?
Who was first?
Well, I think it was you. I don't know.
Okay, so yeah, so I have two things to say. I'm going to start with the first one. There's someone called Roylan who is asking um, to Coronel Turner about Frank Sturgis. I assume that his question is about what do you know about Frank Sturgis, his involvement in the Operation Gladio and the CIA. In fact, we already have information about Frank Sturgis. Um, and his ties with Fidel Castro and the CIA and the Council of Foreign Relations. In fact, it's Gustavo who has a picture of Fidel Castro next to Frank Sturgis. Um, in this same photo, they were both posing next to a mass grave in Cuba. So, like a big hole in the soil filled with corpses and dead people. And we also have information about Frank Sturgis used to boast about um, how he install and overthrow governments in across Latin America. Um, and maybe you know a little bit more than us about Frank Sturgis and his involvement in Operation Gladio and the CIA and all these operations to subvert countries, especially in Latin America. So this is the first thing, and I'm going to finish to let you answer, and then I will pass to the next thing. Thank you.
So Frank Sturgis is one of the CIA operatives that was dispatched in order to train the rebel soldiers of the Castro brothers and Che Guevara. And he was intimately involved in uh, that part of it. So that's for number one. But I ran across him originally when I was doing the research in the Asian theater of the transition from World War II, because he was part of the OSS as well. And he was assigned originally to the China. And so he was intimately involved in the setting up of the, at least with the people that set up the Chiang Kai shek and KMT army in southern China that was running basically all of the opium out of there. So we have him in uh, the Asian theater. We have him in Cuba with the Castros and Che Guevara in the mountains. So he also was working with E. Howard Hunt in Miami. He also was actively involved in Venezuela, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Panama, and Honduras. Those are the operations that we know that he participated in. So he definitely is one of the focal points of the research that I've done. He was intimately involved with the mafia and arranging hit jobs. Um, so his name also came up in some of the JFK files. And so he is one of the guys that definitely got around.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to follow with with my personal question. So my question is, do you think that there is like in this whole what you call international syndicate, is there like many fractions of groups of people that are like in fighting for their own interests, because this is what it looks like. Maybe this is why we have the impression that both sides are controlled by the same, but in fact it's just different groups of the same organization, to say it like that. They are different groups of the same organization, and each group have their own interests. And yeah, maybe this is why we see that the CIA can back the communists, but they also back the anti-communists. So this is my personal question. I don't know if I explained well, and yeah,
So
that's my question. Thanks.
yeah, so I don't think that they think of it as it is one international syndicate, and they work as a hive to protect their collective interest, and they use organizations like the CFR and the Club of Rome and the 300 Committee, the 1001 Fund. There is a less circle in Europe. There's the Bilderberg. There's these forums where they go and collectively work together. And yes, they are on both sides of every issue. So in the United States, you know that you have oligarchs that fund the movement on what everyone here calls the left or the liberal side, and they go to the same cocktail parties and belong to the same groups of as the oligarchs that fund the neocons, because their ultimate aim is the same. It's control. It's to exploit resources both inside the United States and in foreign countries to their benefit. They get rich off of wars. Well, if we all got along, they wouldn't get richer. So they they collectively foment chaos. Um, I've also discovered after World War II the world's map, the geography of the world changed. There were countries that were made up out of whole cloth that didn't even exist before World War II. And if you look around the world, you find out that those new countries that were created in the aftermath of World War II is the pivot point for all of the current chaos, like Israel, Pakistan, and Taiwan, just to name a few. So if they created these countries out of whole cloth, and they can use those countries to destabilize everything in their area, and to the other guy's point, that may be in fact exactly what they were doing with Cuba. Um, Cuba, and like I said, I'm not saying this definitively, but what the impression that I came away with is having Castro in Cuba was very, very, very beneficial to their bottom line. Very beneficial. like trillions of dollars beneficial, because their exploitation of all of Latin America pivoted on the fact that Castro was labeled a communist, and having him there allowed them to label anybody they didn't like throughout Latin America as a communist, and therefore gave them the impetus to go in and destabilize that country. And in every single case, you find the exact same oligarchs getting rich off of the destabilization of these countries. So yes, I think very much that this international syndicate orchestrates chaos, and it actually has a name. It's called the strategy of tension, in order to enrich themselves while we die.
Ariana?
Eduardo, I'm going to have to go in about 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, let me pass the mic to Ariana. She haven't asked. Ariana, are you gonna make a question?
Yes, through my question may closely resemble those previous rays. I feel it is important to ask, no, for no out of repetition, but to underscore the nature of our concerns and inquiries. After everything you have been presented, Coronel, which I personally found very credible, I have a fundamental question. How it is possible that despite the existence of so many operations
I'm sorry you cut out.
again begin, sus Operation Scambrai, Operation Labroni, Operation Pluro, Operation Manso, and many others that you already mentioned, that same regime has remained in power until today. And even worse, that the communists continue to expand through Latin America and even into the United States. Why hasn't the U.S. State Department supported the fight against the violation of our 1940 Constitution? And why has it ignored these facts for 73 years? So this is my question. I think that you already answered all this, but I just want to make that question for the records. Thank you. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you.
I'm gonna pass the mic to Julio, and after Julio, we are gonna be closing down the session, so that way the colonel will be allowed to leave in peace with Cubans. That is important, Colonel. Julio, go ahead. You haven't spoken this night. Julio, are you there? You're not? Okay. Colonel, at least me personally would like to say thank you, big thank you to you. I think it's gonna be a head start for us to start listening to a person with that had some responsibilities in the past in the army. Is a true American in a way that want to doesn't want to make don't want to make any of your bodies, your any other American fellow Americans to die fighting stupid wars and all of that. Also, as an American, and we are also American, most of us are citizens, don't find any benefits on using tax dollar to make able for CIA and other agencies like that to start making such a sense, doing some operations in different countries and all of that, creating of the force of the around the countries, changing things, all in the name of the United States people, all in the name of the benefiting the United States, all in the name of the national security, all in the name of, and then when we put all the money, all the effort, also the dead people, the people that need to go at the end fighting in those countries, they are going to start benefiting from the problem created and getting more money, getting rich, and all of that. So pretty much, the investment they do is just to promote within the government and the agencies to create such problems in different countries, to overthrow government, to move around, to do things, to do that, and then this agency and the government included will spend taxpayer dollars doing that, and then this guy, without making any more investment, is gonna get a big retribution and gonna get a big pay of all these problems. For the last end, well, I hope this is not gonna be the last talking around with us. Maybe you find it a little difficult. We are not used to speak English every day. We pretty much, yeah, pretty much most of us understand, but we don't practice every day because we are surrounded by a lot of Spanish-speaking people and all of that. So that's the difficulty with all of that. So thank you for all that you have done for us today. And if you want to say, Liz, your last words about what you perceive from us right here today. So you're
No,
welcome to do.
I applaud your group, and I understand the. I'm obviously I'm empathetic to the cause that you guys have. I have no similar experience, obviously, and I applaud your dedication and the struggle that you guys have taken on. And I just want to thank you, Eduardo, for asking me to come into the space and share the research um, that I've done. I don't think that people can completely understand that, having spent 30 years in the Air Force and lived all over the world, and the expectation of what I had for my country over the last couple of years doing this research, it's changed my life, because everything that I thought was true, in most cases has turned out to be not true at all, and not true in a way that has been very detrimental to people that have lived all over the world. And the one thing that I would leave people with, because obviously from my background, this hits home to me. Um, when I was stationed overseas, when I deployed overseas to Turkey and Iraq, and I was never deployed, but part of my Air Force career took me to Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. These types of operations put every single American that travels overseas at risk, because the impression that there's no one that lives in Chile or Brazil or Uruguay or Paraguay or Bolivia that have experienced the overthrow of their government, that has there are people that have experienced that, um, that leaves a very bitter taste in their mouth. And we're well aware of people, normal Americans, going overseas and being kidnapped or killed or whatever. And there's never been an accounting for what motivated those people to do that. These operations have backlashes that the people doing them don't give a crap. They're trained to defend themselves. They're trained to look over their shoulders all the time. Americans aren't. And Americans just visiting in foreign countries where some of these operations have taken place, have had retribution taken against them by descendants of people that had a similar experience that they're going to now perpetrate on us. And so these things have lifelong, generational long repercussions. And I have just now made it my mission to make Americans aware of what our government has done in our name. And you can do with what you want with the information, but every single piece of the information that I share has factual, documented, declassified CIA documents, declassified State Department documents, um, verification to them. They are not made lightly, because it completely threw everything I thought I knew about my government out the window. So I just want to thank you for the invite and having me on.
Thank you, Colonel. Most appreciated. I think pretty much all of us will be thankful for with your work today for a long time, because it also help us to understand as a regular U.S. citizen what the feeling that normal people have about the mishandling of things of our own government. So
Yeah.
pretty much for Cuban, it's very difficult to understand that such a sentiment. But most of us, we already started understanding how it feels. We also see in the United States these days, and we also have maybe the ability to looking at today events in the United States, understand what our siblings, parents, grandparents, and all of the people in Cuba felt at the time that all this craziness was happening since 1952. Right now, pretty much we are in the same situation here in the States, and we are looking and seeing and say, oh, now I understand why they didn't do this. Now I understand why things go crazy that way. Because it's pretty much the same play. The same play that all these shenanigans have put out in different countries, that those are the same plays they're using in here. So they create the same result, the same problems. So it's simple as that. Again, thank you, Coronel.
Sure.
We'll be in touch. I think if that today's is not going to be the last, that may be another one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.